Welcome to the Prescription for Success podcast with your host, Dr. Randy Cook.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Prescription for Success podcast. I'm Dr. Randy Cook, and I'll be your host for the program. Before we get into today's interview, let me just remind everyone that our podcast is brought to you by MD Coaches, a company dedicated to developing and empowering physicians and other healthcare professionals to realize a greater potential and to achieve a greater level of satisfaction in their chosen fields. You can find MD Coaches on the web at mymdcoaches.com. My interview guest today is Dr. Niran Al-Agba, a very busy pediatrician in Silverdale, Washington. Dr. Al-Agba grew up dreaming of becoming a physician, and after completing medical school and residency, she joined her dad in his very well-established pediatrics practice in her old hometown. Early on, she discovered that she had a talent for writing, and eventually she became a regular columnist for her local newspaper, where she regularly writes about a variety of topics, including medical, social, and political. She has also written a book due for release in November of 2020. So now, let's hear that interview. And it is my pleasure today to be speaking with Dr. Niran Al-Agba in Silverdale, Washington. Niran, thank you so much for being here and welcome to Prescription for Success.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Just one thing I want to, out of curiosity, before we get into the discussion around you and your journey to success, I'm a little curious. I know that Washington was the state where we identified the first case of COVID-19 in the U.S. And for our listeners, we're recording in October, so that was like 9 months ago. I'm just curious, can you give us an update on where the state of Washington is and how things have been going for the last 9 months?
Well, it's been a really long 9 months, or at least it feels like it. I actually had, the nursing home, which was kind of, I would say, ground zero for a lot of the first COVID cases. I think there were so many deaths so quickly for us that it was almost a wake-up call. And a number of my patients, actually 2 patients, had grandparents who died in the life care center. And so early on, we were really affected. At least I felt affected because my patients were affected. And it just seemed to get real very quickly. So I would say, like the rest of the country, we quickly shut down. We're still have a mask mandate. But as we sit here now, they're considering opening up schools, starting with kindergarten and first graders in another couple weeks. So again, life has changed quite a bit, but we're starting to kind of find our way.
Do you have a feel, and I know it's hard because Washington is where you've been for the last 9 months, but do you have a feel for whether you think Washington has behaved differently than other parts of the country because they were first, or do you just not? Is it hard to tell? What do you think?
Well, I think we got lucky in a way. I know that's strange to say that. But again, because the kind of ground zero, really early on, there were a number of elderly people and a number of them died. And I think that was a little bit different than New York, where the disease appeared to be spreading sort of not as obviously. And then all of a sudden, all heck broke loose and they had so many cases. So in a way, I think, like I said, we got a wake-up call early. And to be honest with you, I've been open the entire time. I never shut down. I've been seeing people in the car right away. I went to that within a couple of days. And I've only had 2 tests that were positive this whole time.
That's a pretty good record.
It is. And maybe the kids don't test positive as often, maybe they don't, have the receptors
But I
in their
bet you would have
nose,
known if they had parents that were infected. I bet you would have known.
Yes.
Probably.
Oh, yeah. There were a number of parents that were infected and the kids tested negative. So that's what I was going to say, that there probably are a number of cases that I've seen, but the only ones that tested positive were 2 asymptomatic teenagers. So we've changed our lives a little bit, but I think we're still moving forward. And I don't think we were as devastated as New York because of that early cluster. That's probably, been helpful for us.
And of course, the population density in places like New York City makes a big difference. But,
correct. This disease has been a referendum on cities.
You bet.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the update. And now I really do want to get around to talking about you. I'm interested, as we always are, in how you got interested in medicine. Was there a physician relative or a physician hero? How did you get connected?
Well, relatives, yes. My grandfather was a family physician in Tacoma, which is about 45-minute drive from here, where my mom was born and raised. And then my father was a pediatric endocrinologist. And
so lots of docs around your family.
Yes. In fact, apparently I told my dad when I was 5, after touring the hospital, that I was, quote, born to be a doctor.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. My story is about as boring as they probably come. And that physician who was a pathologist who took my first grade class on the tour is actually still around. He still sends me patients. And
really?
He does. I was just talking about him the other day and someone said, Dr. Hallman says hello. And he is the doctor who was down in the lab giving a tour to my class. And he later told my parents, some kids were squeamish in the back, but this little girl with pigtails, with, brown hair, she was so interested in what was going on. And my parents kind of looked at each other and thought, well, yeah, that's our kid.
And I'm also interested to know, now you mentioned your grandfather, was he a first generation American? Was he an immigrant, or what was
my dad was an immigrant. Actually he was born and raised in Iraq. And no, my grandfather, my mom's father, was not. His father, so we had a pharmacist before that. So my great grandfather was a pharmacist in Montana. And he actually ran for the state Senate. So a politician and a pharmacist, and then doctors ever since.
You well got it all covered. All right. Well, it sounds like you made the decision pretty early and never really looked back. And in any case, came time for college, and you moved to the Midwest. How did that come about?
Well, that's another interesting story. I graduated early, so I skipped kindergarten and first grade. I was 5, turning 6 in the second grade. So when I graduated from high school, I was 16. And I was the oldest of 4 children. I had 3 younger brothers. And my parents were kind of nervous about me leaving the state. Back then, I remember having to carry a letter that gave permission for me to get medical care without my parents. I mean, remember, laws have changed a lot. So I think it was probably a little bit scary for them to send their daughter off out of state.
I bet it was. A 16-year-old, I think so, yeah.
Yep. And so I really liked the Lyman Briggs. It was kind of a science honors college at Michigan State. And they had rolling admissions, which worked in my favor. And so when I finally was able to convince my parents to let me go out of state, that was one of the college programs that I really was interested in.
And your major, your undergraduate major, was physiology. You were an honors graduate. And then there is this thing that I spotted in your CV. You had a specialization in health humanities.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? What do you have to do to get that?
Well, what I had to do is take a few classes in like history of medicine, ethics, let's see, healthcare systems of the world. I'm just trying to think back to those classes.
That's a pretty good idea.
It is. It was a really neat. I'm so pleased. I still think back to the different things I learned. What utilitarianism is. How do you make ethical decisions and why? End of life decisions. And we really got to learn, read stories that were going on at the time. That would have been the 90s. and then talk about why we would or would not have made the same decision. And so we were talking about, obviously Dr. Kevorkian was kind of big in Michigan at the time. And
Indeed.
so, right. So those kinds of questions as a college student, the professor would kind of lead these discussions, and we would be assigned a position, kind of like a debate team sort of approach. And they'd say, okay, you're going to argue for the right to die. You're going to argue for, you can't, physicians shouldn't be killing patients. And I go, or write your paper or have your class discussion. And so it was a really a neat group of courses that we were able to take.
Sounds like a really wise thing for them to be doing. Just to give you an example from my personal experience, of course, I applied to medical school about the time that they invented penicillin. I think it was a while back, but in any case, we were encouraged to do our undergraduate work in a liberal arts college, a heavy science curriculum, but they wanted us to be exposed to the humanities, and allegedly people who had that background were more likely to be admitted. But it sounds like Michigan State was addressing that issue much more directly by pointing you in an area that really stood to support your decision making once you got into medical school and once you became a physician. Am I reading that right?
Yeah. I think it was really. I'm not aware of anybody else who was kind of given these opportunities to take medical ethics classes as an undergraduate. So I do think it was really forward thinking, or they really were kind of trailblazing, I think. And I've found it, I still have that ethics book somewhere at home. And I've talked about things like that with my kids even. And I still find it useful to discuss even today.
But clearly it was far different from 4 years in a lab with test tubes and petri dishes and things of that nature.
Oh, absolutely. And that is not my thing. I got to be honest. And I admire the people who, for them, it is their thing. I think the same decision I made at 5 kind of carried through. I was interested in genetics initially. And of course, back then, when I was really little, my dad said, pathology is the field that deals with genetics. And of course, obviously now we have genetics dealing with genetics. But right. as I grew up and kind of, babysat or just did other things in my life, I really found I loved children and working with children. And so I was never your kind of test tube microscope kind of girl. It's just not my thing. I really like people. I like interacting with people. And I do like some of that ethical decision making. I mean, I face it in a small town all the time. I mean, I have people who ask me about their neighbors who I saw yesterday and had to admit to the hospital. So, I mean, these things come up for me on a daily basis. And I've always tried to look at things from that lens. What I remember the most about that class was simply, she said, these questions don't necessarily have right answers. You can say you're a certain religion or you have a belief system and therefore there's a right answer. But a lot of these ethical dilemmas don't really have a right answer. It's a matter of perspective, and it's a matter of trying to understand both perspectives. And so, to me, that's been extremely valuable in what I do every day.
Yeah, that's a good stage of your life to learn that lesson for sure.
It really is.
Well, it sounds like undergraduate school was not much of a challenge for you. You graduated with honors, and then back to Washington for medical school. How did you make that choice?
Well, that's a great story. That's the only place I got in, and I was the last person to get into my class. I was notified, so I was put on the wait list. And back then, there was this great dean of admissions, Dr. Werner Sampson is his name, and he was famous for kind of hammering at the students when we would go and meet with him to find out why we didn't get in. So I remember I called, and they said, well, you're on what's called the unranked wait list. And so they had 20 that were ranked. And then they had this pile of 20 kind of just in case. And so they said, Dr. Sampson meets with students. Do you want to make an appointment? I said, okay. I mean, I didn't really even know what I was doing. So I said, all right. So that summer, this would have been the summer of 95, I was working actually at the health district as a health educator. I hadn't gotten into medical school. And I went to meet with him, and he sort of looked at me and said, well, just try again next year. You don't really have anything that stands out. He also told me that he didn't know how my dad could be successful as a pediatric endocrinologist in a small town. and he's so great. He's a straight shooter. I got to know him very well, obviously, through the years. And so I left and I thought, I had done this sport in growing up, baton twirling, and I had been on a national and even world level. There's still tapes that keep showing up on YouTube here and there. I don't have copies of these things, but people will post them because they have old videotapes and such.
I'm going to Google it.
Yeah, you might want to Google it. And so I was irritated with this guy. I thought, he really didn't know anything about me. And I mentioned the baton twirling, and he said, well, it's not like playing basketball or the violin. So, so true to my form, which is kind of the theme of my life, I wrote him a letter about kind of what I thought of him. It was a nice letter. He says I called him stupid. I definitely did not call him stupid. But I said, you don't know anything about this sport. Here's a videotape. This is back then when we had VHS tapes. I said, here's the tape of my last world competition. I'm sure you will find it equally as challenging as basketball or the violin. So I get a call about it, and I kind of told my dad I had done this, and he said, oh my gosh, go to the post office, go get that letter. You can't do that. You can't send it. And I thought, you know what? I'm a person. He's a person. I'm going to tell him kind of what I thought. And I started it with, I was disappointed with our meeting, and here's a chance to learn something. And so I got a call about a month later, and I got in. And when I called to accept the position, I was so excited. And the lady on the phone said, oh, you're the baton twirler. Oh my gosh, everybody's seen your tape. We love it. It's amazing. And I said, oh, wow. And she goes, I said, did Dr. Sampson see it? She said, oh, he definitely saw it. He gave it back to me when I graduated. And he told me, obviously he used to tease me that I'll always take a baton twirler from now on. But I think he kind of liked that sort of approach where I said, hey, wait a second, buddy. I don't think you gave me a chance. And here's something I think I can teach you.
Obviously, he was impressed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have to admit, I talked to a lot of physicians on this program, and you're the very first one that ever muscled their way into medical school on the basis of twirling. I'm very impressed.
Well, thank you. He did put me on the admissions committee, just so you know, and we had a great relationship. He was at my wedding, as a matter of fact. He's just a great mentor. That's
an even better part of the story. If you don't mind, I want to follow this just a little bit because I'm a little bit surprised. You're an honors graduate from a prestigious university, and yet you're not accepted on the first round consideration in any medical school. Well, let me ask you this. Were there multiple schools where you applied?
There were a couple of other schools. I want to say I applied to about 7 or 8 at the time. And I got an interview, I think, at Wayne State University, and I was also on the wait list there. But at that time, for example, Michigan State wouldn't look at you if you weren't a state resident. So, there were a few rules like that kind of, precluded me, I think, from getting much further.
And I suppose that it may have become much more competitive for women as opposed to the days when I applied, which, as I say, it was a very long time ago. But I know that historically female applicants have much better scholastic backgrounds, so maybe it's harder for them to distinguish between who's a good risk and who's not, because all of the grades are so good.
Right. Although I wasn't.
So they have to look at who is a twirler, right?
Well, potentially. I think what's interesting is I wasn't that great of a student. I mean, with honors was above a 3. I can't remember if it was a 3.6 or 3.5, but I was at like a 3.7, I think, when I graduated. I didn't have the 4.0 grades. I had good solid MCAT scores. I remember that part. And I think I was young. I was 19 years old when I applied to med school. And I think I will say this. I'm not young, even now when I'm still on the admissions committee and interview, I think it's hard for a 19-year-old in an interview to compare to, let's say, a 25 or 26-year-old in life experience, maturity. And the last thing a school wants to do is take someone who, quote, isn't completely sure, who they're not sure has really lived or had enough experience to know what they want to do.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think that played into it.
So what was medical school like for you? About like what you expected, harder, not harder? What was it like?
It really was about what I expected. I mean, I think it was a really busy time. I obviously moved to Seattle within a week of getting my acceptance, and so it was a little bit of a whirlwind to start off with. But it was like anybody else's experience. There were great students. I had my 21st birthday right after our final exams. My whole class went out with me for the most part, so it was just an extension kind of college as far as, it was hard work. We went to class, we were in cadaver lab, and we did as much learning as we could. It's like trying to get a drink of water out of a fire hose.
Well said. And you actually made reference a few minutes ago about your decision to go into pediatrics. Were you fairly sure when you started medical school that it was going to be peds, or did you give it some time to consider other things or not?
So both, really. I started out thinking I was going to do pediatrics, and then my clinical years, while I would say my non-clinical years were just, I didn't love them, but put in the work and the time. I loved I loved the clinical years. That was really, I loved everything I did, whether it was internal medicine, whether it was family practice, OB, surgery. I really enjoyed almost everything I did. And so I did struggle a little bit with, do I do internal medicine? Do I do peds? Do I do family to kind of cover it all? And so I did really try to search and figure out what I liked the best. And really, when push came to shove, it was really children that I enjoyed. That summer after my first year of med school, there was this chance to go and run a summer camp for foster kids, some of the worst foster kids in Seattle that had the really painful backgrounds. And it was in this tiny little area called Home, Washington, which is kind of between it's on the peninsula, kind of between Bremerton and Tacoma on the Olympic Peninsula. And I'll never forget, it was this Catholic organization that put it on. So they wanted some boy med student and a girl to come out, spend time with these kids, do some health education. And what probably really cemented it for me was I had these kids that were tough. I mean, these big, strong kids. And I remember they wanted to do this like icebreaker where kids were playing, old school games, and these kids were not listening. They didn't care what the counselors said. I mean, it was chaos. And I remember with the boys, especially, I started kind of, if they didn't listen, they had to do 10 push-ups, and no ifs, ands, or buts. They had to do them. Wow. Get down, do it. And so what's funny is as the week progressed, I really bonded with these kids. I just had such a great time. And at one point they took us out on this expedition. They divided the girls and the boys. We camped outside, no tents. It was really bare essentials. And one day into it, the counselors from the boys camp came and got me and said, yeah, we can't do this. It was great. They're like, we can't control these boys. They're dumping bug juice on each other. They're like not doing anything they're supposed to do. We need you to leave the girls camp. And of course, for me, the girls camp was like, no problem. We were making meals and everybody was functional. And so they made me go over to this, and they were on this like kind of isolated island. And there was a bathroom because I was like, I'm not going if there's no bathroom. And so I spent the next 2 days camping with all these kids, and I was smaller than they were. These were these teenage boys, 17, 18, they're 6 feet tall. I'm 5 feet and a half an inch, but I just had a great time. And I remember at the end, the counselors are like, way in the barracks packing stuff up saying, thank God this is over. And I was standing at the bus hugging every single kid. I was sort of crying as they're getting on the bus, saying goodbye to them. And I remember thinking, you know what? I think I probably got to do this. Like, this is probably what I'm good at.
Sounds like it was the right thing to do.
It was. I love what I do. I love it today the same way. I still think of kids the same.
I guess that was going to be my next question. Looking back, it sounds like there are no regrets.
Oh, absolutely not. I wouldn't change a thing. Not at all.
And right away, as soon as you had your MD, you made yourself available as a clinical instructor at the medical school where you just graduated, right?
Well, sort of. I went away to residency. I matched in Denver, Colorado, at the University of Colorado, and it's mixed with Denver Children's Hospital.
Yes, I did leave that out, didn't I?
Well, it's such a pivotal time in my life. I probably will never forget it. But So I spent 3 years there doing the pediatric training, obviously, before I came back. And Dr. Sampson was still sitting on the admissions committee. He was still the dean of admissions. So when I came back, I said, I'd like to rejoin the admissions committee as a faculty member. And so he said, yeah, you need to apply and get on as a clinical instructor, and then no problem. And so that's how that kind of came about later when I came home to practice.
And just to make sure that we've covered all the events, I'm going to gather that in as much as you were fairly confident of what your specialty was going to be, despite the workload that all residents have to deal with, were you relatively happy and satisfied during those residency years, or was it a matter of, gee, I can't wait for this to be over, or what was it like?
Oh, I had a countdown. In fact, the attendings, I remember one attending in the ICU. I had to do 2 months of ICU back to back. And my first night of call in the ICU, I did 8 femoral lines and I coded 3 kids. And then the next morning, I remember I was teaching my pulmonary fellow. I was like, oh, I've done so many femoral lines tonight. Why don't I just talk you through a femoral line? Because she said, I didn't get that many in residency. So, and I was letting like my fellow residents like, oh, you didn't get one? Come on over here. You could do this next one. I'm done doing femoral lines. And so I had kind of bad luck. And so somewhere in the middle of those 60 days in the ICU, I had at one point, I think 21 days with no break. I did start to struggle a little bit. And I remember one of the attendings said something to me and I said, well, in 15 months, 2 weeks and 3 days, the decision will be mine. And I'm looking very forward to that. So, I had a countdown, but to the program's credit, they trained us really well. I mean, and this was this was the old days where we didn't have those. I think they have hour limits now. We had no limits. We did call, which really wasn't terrible, every 4 for most of residency. I think when we were doing oncology, it was every 3. And we were busy. I mean, there are nights I was in charge of 70 patients. There was always somebody who was coding. And it was busy, but it really taught us to be comfortable in almost any setting. And that has been really important coming out in a small area. And even as one of my electives, I did a month with a flight team. So there's Life Flight 1 and 2 in Colorado. And so I was working with the helicopter team and I got to do like pericardiocenteses. I got to do a lot of things that I'm not sure everybody gets to do today. Yeah. On people's lawns. And it was adults. It wasn't just children. Mm-hmm. So obviously working with Life Flight 1, it's in the mountains and back to Denver. So we would go and pick up ski injuries. I remember one of my first calls was landing on someone's lawn and he had died outside, had a heart attack outside. And so there was a lot of experience, hands-on experience that I think has been really important as I've come out of practice.
That's got to be truly invaluable.
It really is.
Remember medical school? You were confident, studious, hardworking, and you learned what to expect in all manner of patient care. Then reality struck. Regulations, expenses, staff management, and administration. Is this what we signed up for? Stress on the verge of burnout, no time for family, or the reason we got into medicine. Helping people. What are the options when you're afraid you're in the wrong career? Transition, teach, quit? What if there was another way? MD Coaches can help. We're a team of medical professionals with a century of experience in the clinical and business sides of medicine. More importantly, MD Coaches has been where you are, stressed and trying to navigate a world school didn't prepare us for. MD Coaches is your mentor, your confidant, to help you make your practice shine, navigate administrations, and successfully lead staff and projects. Or if you're ready to transition, we can help there too. MD Coaches is doctors helping doctors. Visit our website to receive a free, no-obligation consultation. Go to mymdcoaches.com/RX. That's mymdcoaches.com/RX. Isn't it time someone else was on your side? Don't let the business of being a doctor stop you from doing what you love. That site again, mymdcoaches.com/RX. Visit us today.
Physician Outlook is a new magazine platform built for physicians and by physicians, and it's designed to showcase unique physician talents. Sometimes it might be clinical talents, but mostly it's about the intersection between clinical and non-clinical talents, whether it be writing or painting or cooking, or maybe even making a political statement in front of a state and local governing body, or even at the nation's capital, and dozens of other things. It's available online and in print. It's visually stunning on all of its platforms. I promise it's really unique in terms of physician lifestyle magazines. I think you'll really enjoy it. We think it's just the thing to fill your prescription for success. And like the Prescription for Success podcast, Physician Outlook magazine amplifies the voice of any doctor who has something to say, and also uniquely engages patients who still believe in physician-led, team-based care. And Prescription for Success listeners can get $20 off an annual subscription fee by visiting rxforsuccesspodcast.com/Physician Outlook. But now, so upon completion of your residency and you're back in Washington, this instructorship that you had at the medical school, was that your only job, or did you have a private practice elsewhere? What was the situation?
I joined my dad. In fact, I came here to make sure it was what I wanted to do in the fall of 2001. And I knew that's kind of what I wanted to do. And so I joined him. And it's crazy. I still remember the moment I drove it back home into my hometown, done with my training, ready to do this. And I got this kind of sinking feeling in my stomach. And I thought, well, there's no turning back now. I had said no to fellowships. I just wanted to get out of the academic center. And I mean, I liked all my colleagues. I liked all the attendings. I guess I'm not much for all of that formal medical
bureaucracy.
Yeah, bureaucracy is probably the best word for it. I'm kind of a on my own kind of girl. So anyway, I remember when I drove into town and thought, well, it's time to sink or swim. And I think, I've made it. And then to stay attached to the UW, I teach advanced life support classes at Children's Hospital, and then I've worked on the admissions committee ever since.
And is your dad still in practice?
No, he passed away 3 years ago. In fact, it's the anniversary is tomorrow. He died October 21st, 2017. And he saw 17 patients on his last day, six weeks before that. So he was working. Yeah, he was still working. And I had to take over, we obviously were together for 16 years. And so I had to take over. He had a full schedule of patients for the next 2 months after he had his heart attack and was in the hospital. Goodness. And so I had to take over all of those patients. And I was routinely behind. I was running 3 hours behind. People were coming in. My dad had been here since 1971 in practice. So we're on third generation. And even now I have one fourth generation patient. So grandparents were coming in, they were crying, they were asking what's going on with my dad. This place was really, it was insane. And patients were amazing. This is where I learned how special it is to be part of a small town like this. People were bringing me dinners. They were bringing the staff dinners. Patients arranged every day for a couple of weeks. A different patient would show up with a lunch for the staff because we weren't getting to get a break.
Wow. And
they were landscaping the grounds, helping me with funeral music. I mean, people just really came together to help. And
that's really special.
It really was. It was.
I can't imagine trying to juggle that in the midst of dealing with your grief. It must have been truly trying. And the fact that you had people that were right there ready to rally around you and keep you upright. You were fortunate indeed, I think.
Yeah, I feel fortunate. I also had a little bit of training. We lost my brother suddenly in 2007. He fell off the roof of a building in Seattle. He was 26. And, yep. And it was in the newspaper, and one of the other pediatricians that had retired called and said, can I work for you guys while you take some time off? And so obviously our family was devastated, and I got married, believe it or not, a month after that happened. It was a rough year in 2007, but I had already kind of, I don't want to say learned to grieve, but that was completely unexpected. He was younger than I was. I expected him to be with me for my lifetime. My brothers and I were close. So that was really where I learned. I mean, I broke down in front of patients. That was a really hard time for me. And at least with my dad, he was 81. It at least was, I would call it more a natural order of things. And I would say I was more able to comfort other people who were grieving and didn't know how to talk to their children about his death. I had already kind of I think I was a little more experienced at dealing with grief, knowing that this is part of the way it works. We don't get to decide, when our time is or when we're going to die. And it was fascinating, though, because in a way, if you think about it, how many children lose somebody close to them who's not a grandparent, right? Or a parent. And so many patients came in and they're looking at me for guidance. Like, well, what do I tell my 6-year-old? She wants to see Dr. Saad. And I looked at her and I said, you tell her he's dying, and you tell her to make him a card, and you tell her to put glitter on it and say that she, loves him and hopes he gets better, or whatever it is that she wants to say to him. You tell her she needs to say goodbye. And I knew early on, I remember the first day I went in there and he coded and had he had a balloon pump, and he had so many lines and drains. And I remember looking at this going, you know what, this isn't going to end well. And somehow I had that feeling, and I'm so glad early on the patients were willing and comfortable coming and saying, what do we say to our children? And I mean, I took hundreds of cards over there to the hospital, and kids did so well afterwards. And my own children, same thing. I told them early on, we need to say goodbye every time we see Papa, because we just don't know what's going to happen. And I learned a lot. I learned that children can teach us how to grieve. And so many of them did, and they still will talk about him. Once in a while, I have a child. He's a man now, actually, and he was in today or this week, actually, as a matter of fact. And he always calls me the replacement. He always calls me the replacement, Dr. Al-Agba. And he's a really, neat kid. And he still talks about my dad and how much he misses him. And it's been really an interesting experience to be part of people's lives in a way that I don't think the rest of the country necessarily experiences all the time. This would be like medicine learned by apprenticeship, where the doctor's child takes over the practice and keeps going as the doctor for the town. And so many of these grandparents remember when I was born, and they remember hearing about me growing up, and they remember hearing I was going to come and work with him. And they were telling me stories about how they met him and why they chose him to be their pediatrician. I mean, there's almost nothing better than that kind of bond between patient and doctor.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to follow up on that just a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm trying to visualize what it must have been like for you to fill in the enormous gap that obviously existed in your practice at that time, and yet be in a position of having to deal with your own grief. And you're kind of making it sound like you processed your grief relatively well, but I want to make sure I didn't get that wrong. Am I correct about that, or
you are?
What else can you tell me?
Well, I can tell you that something wasn't right about my dad. We kind of got into a little bit of an argument. We rarely argued, but we got into a little bit of an argument. I want to say about 2 or 3 weeks before he had his fatal heart attack, or his heart attack that landed him in the hospital. And something wasn't right. I can just tell you, I've worked with him for 16 years, and I just knew something was off. And I remember looking at him and saying, something's wrong with you. And he goes, no, it's all you.
Yeah.
And I said, no, I know something's wrong with you. And now you know that I know. And what's interesting is I came back a week later and I just said, look, I'm sorry I upset you. I don't want whatever time you have left to kind of affect our relationship. And I love you. And he sort of said, okay, well, I don't really know what to say. And so I remember feeling kind of, hurt a little bit. And I remember sort of honestly crying on the way home and thinking, okay, I just had this feeling. I don't know how else to explain it. And then like probably a week later after we had that conversation, is when he ended up having his heart attack. And so somehow I knew. And so I think the grief began before he actually got sick. And one of my good friends, when I told her what had happened with our discussion, she's actually a counselor. She doesn't work as a counselor, but she was for the school district before she changed jobs. And she said, I think it sounds to me like you don't have the same dad that you've had for 42 years. And it sounds like maybe he's slipping away is what she said. And I remember thinking, that's how it feels right now. And so to be honest, I did grieve. You always do when it's a parent. But somehow I knew. And so the grief for me started before everyone else's grief. And somehow when I walked into that hospital room, I remember getting the call that morning and my mom said, here's Dr. So-and-so on the phone. And he tells me what happened. And I thought, oh boy, again, I just had that feeling like, I don't think he's going to be back to this office. And so the grief for me began earlier, and he was in the hospital for 5 weeks. And that's when I think everyone else was really grieving. So for whatever reason, it kind of worked in a way that I could help other people grieve. I could help my own children grieve, and I could still kind of manage to keep us afloat. I'd never done the payroll taxes before. I had done the paychecks once or twice because we still do them manually, but I really didn't know much about business ownership. And obviously I needed to concentrate. There was a lot I needed to learn in that, 2-month period.
I bet.
And so I think I was able to do it because I had started grieving before it happened.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. That really is a powerful story. And I just want to move on to a few other things that sort of fascinated me about what has happened during your years in practice. One of the things that you apparently chose to do, was to become the lead physician for the county juvenile detention center.
Yeah.
I want to know some more about that.
Well, so public health has always been kind of an interest of mine. Obviously, after college, I worked for the public health district before I was even into medical school. And then my research in medical school was working with the health district, doing home visits with the purpose of preventing child abuse. So I've always maintained really close ties with the health district. We're now actually, I've been here now for the 4th health. We just had a new health officer who's been established in the middle of COVID. But I've worked with the health officers basically for the last 25 years in this county. And so when one of them was going to retire, his name was Scott Lindquist. He actually works in epidemiology for the state. He's a pediatric infectious disease doctor. And he said, it's outside of our public health scope, but I want somebody who cares about children, cares about taking care of children once they're in juvenile hall. And the way Washington state rules work is they lose their insurance when they either go into juvenile hall or somehow, I'm sure they don't lose their private insurance, but if they were on state insurance, the state Department of Health or whatever doesn't cover their health care. Then it becomes the responsibility of the juvenile hall entity. And so he said, I want to make sure these kids have good care. And he said, we'll just kind of pay you on a contract basis. You don't have to go over super often, but I'd like you to kind of take this over. And so again, I like kids. I think I do pretty well with them. And so I did it for a while until they decided at one point to turn it over to the same healthcare providers for the state jail or the adults, the adult correctional facilities.
Yeah, I can understand how that might have been a problem because those, they do it in Washington, but most states contract those things out to a bigger company that does what they call correctional facility medicine, and it gets very detached and bureaucratic. So
though there were some neat experiences, and I will tell you one that was one of my favorites. I had been working with this kid kind of over the phone. The nurse that was at juvenile hall was calling me with this case, and I never asked his name. And he'd had like a broken arm, and we weren't sure about what the plan was, and we couldn't get a hold of anyone in ortho. So we were transferring this kid. They had their initial care somewhere else. Then they were put in juvenile hall here. And so I get to the juvenile hall and I see this child's name. And I said, wait a second, I know him. And she said, yeah, I told him that Dr. Al-Agba was going to be coming to see him. And he got very excited. And I said, I think it's been about 10 years since I've seen him. And the details are kind of fuzzy, but his mom at one point either moved or wanted to change doctors or something. And so I remember when I sent when the guard went to go get this boy, I looked at the guard and I said, I don't care what he's done. I'm going to hug him when I see him. And I'll never forget, there was no longer this 7-year-old boy. Of course, that's what I remembered. He was now 17 years old, and he was like 6'3", and this big, strapping, tall man comes through the door. And I said, let's just call him Johnny. I just said, oh my gosh, Johnny, you're a man, you're grown up. And he goes, Dr. Al-Agba, you're so tiny now. And I gave him a big hug. Yeah, I gave him a big hug. And then, I went to take care of whatever I needed to take care of. But I remember in a way being so sad because to me, he was this 7-year-old boy with all this promise.
Of course.
And, whatever he'd done, I'll avoid the details, but he broke the law is what I will say. And he'd really had a hard time of it. There was a lot of chaos in his life, and it doesn't sound like anyone had stood up for him, as often is the case sometimes in these situations. And I just remember thinking when I left, how sad I was that I couldn't change the outcome for this one kid.
Yeah, those. I bet there are quite a few painful stories there because. Let's face it, if a child winds up in jail, that there's something much bigger wrong someplace else, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's true. It's hard to let go of sometimes.
I bet. Well, one other area that I want to talk about, which actually I'm kind of most fascinated with, apparently about 3 years ago, you became a fairly prolific writer for the newspaper.
Yeah.
You want to take it from there?
Sure. Interestingly enough, I started writing for sort of Kevin MD and a couple of other websites, the healthcare blog. I don't tend to shy away from kind of tough topics. And obviously one of our local hospitals was consolidating and becoming more monopolized. And I'm a private practice, and I've, maintained a fiercely independent private practice. I'm still on paper. I still have the same dictation. I use a dictaphone just like in the old days.
Wow.
And the same dictation.
I'm so proud of you. You're a hero.
Thank you. Thank you. I really kind of refuse to change until there's a better system. And to me, the dictation system works so well and it's so efficient. I'm not going to change until somebody either forces me to, or I'm going to try to keep finding workarounds. The dictation person who does the dictations has been working for this office since 1975.
Wow.
So, really, it's still a wonderful way to function and to work. And so obviously this whole community was monopolizing, and they're buying up all the physician practices. And so I ended up writing or submitting to the newspaper my first piece, which was on the fact that prices go up when you end up monopolizing the care in an area. And I think I wrote one or two over the summer. And then when my dad got sick, believe it or not, it's the same time. When my dad got sick, I ended up writing this article about, there was a guy in, I think, Florida who was defending his staff at an urgent care. And there's a video someone recorded where he's saying, get out. You're go, you're creating problems, get out. I want my staff to be safe. And everybody sort of was hammering the doctor. And I ended up writing about, wait a second. We are human beings. We grieve. We have losses. We make mistakes. We are not perfect. And all we have to give, we are trying to give to our patients. And so I sort of wrote this post about, I know, or I was basically saying we need to be given grace. And I said, I know because my patients have given me more grace than any doctor deserves. And I wrote about everything that had happened, patients bringing me food, patients watching my kids, patients bearing with me when I'm 4 hours behind in my office because, there were patients scheduled for my dad and for me, and I didn't know what to do. And basically a kind of a thank you to the community for bearing with me and saying, you never know what's going on in your doctor's life. Maybe it's good to give them some grace sometimes too. And it was the number one column of the year, actually, in the newspaper.
I'm glad to hear that.
And yeah, so that's how I got hired. So at the time, the editor called and he said, your columns were popular, but he said, this one even beat the news articles. So he said, I think it'd be silly for me not to hire you. And so I've kind of been writing a column every other week ever since. And
how do you find the time to do that?
Well, sometimes it's so interesting. Sometimes I just get frustrated and I knock it out. It's almost like a diary in a way, of my life, of practice, of my experiences in practice for my patients. What started out as medicine, like venting about different insurances and things that would happen, has become really interesting as the community has tolerated me veering off into really tough subjects like racism, elections, abortion. I mean, you name it, I've written about it.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've read several of your columns, and I'm very impressed. I mean, you are not the average doctor that's putting articles in the paper about what to do with your child's skinned knee.
I know that'd be so boring.
You're giving really forceful opinions on potentially explosive subjects, and you don't shy away from it at all. And you've continued to do it over a period of time. So, I was about to ask you, have you gotten any substantial pushback from that? And clearly, if you have, it hasn't slowed you down. So, what has the experience been like?
Well, it's been really interesting because, practicing in a small town, obviously, I feel like a lot of the time I know everybody, or at least they know me. And so there's a little bit of a either spotlight or you're put under a microscope to a certain extent. And the way I've tried to deal with that microscope is just be as transparent as possible. And so I sort of write like I talk. I just sort of lay out what I think. I either use data to back it up, obviously leaving room for, I get that you may not agree with me, but this is how I see it. And I have gotten pushback. There was a shooting of a Native American man or indigenous man about a year ago. And I wrote a post. They were going after this one police officer. And I remember thinking, this is a bigger problem than we're acknowledging. This isn't about one police officer and one man. This is about a nation that doesn't necessarily value people of color the same way that we do whites. And it's a nation that should probably be talking about it. So I attempted what I would call a very clumsy post, trying to express this sentiment. Not saying that I have the answers, because of course I don't have the answers. And the impact, okay, so there's intent and then there's impact. And really, I've learned impact matters. And sometimes we don't know our impact. And that's obviously where we can learn. And one of my indigenous families, the mom called me and said, look, this was a disaster. You hurt me. You hurt my community. You did a terrible job expressing what you were trying to say. And she goes, I'm really offended. And I thought, and I remember thinking, I'm so sorry. Like I genuinely I just felt so bad because that was in no way, obviously my intention.
You're trying to be on her side, right?
I was trying to be on her side. I did a terrible job of it. And acknowledging, it's really hard to acknowledge, especially if you start with good intent, it's hard to acknowledge a less than good impact, but it's important. It's really important. And so at the end of that conversation, she said, I think you need to do another column. And I said, oh Lord, I'm so scared. I did such a bad job. Like, I don't think I can do this. And she said, I'll help you. And I said, okay. And so her and I kept sending her drafts. She's like, nope, this isn't good. Nope, this doesn't sound right. And she's so phenomenal. I mean, really, to spend time with your doctor teaching them something I should already know. I mean, that's investment in a relationship. And so I remember when I turned in that post about 6 months later, I wrote what I call an I'm sorry post, which said, look, I acknowledge my impact was not good. This is what I was trying to say. And this is what I'm going to do in the future to be better at writing columns. And I talked about, when I'm doing this in front of an entire community that knows me, I'm consenting to learn. I'm basically consenting to fall down on my face, pick myself back up, and learn to be better in front of all of you. And I hope you'll give me the opportunity to keep doing that. And what's interesting is when I turned it into the paper, the editor called me. He goes, listen, you can't be apologizing for a million columns. And I said, no, this is something actually I feel strongly I should apologize for, because I really didn't feel right when I saw what the impact was of the previous column. because people were still writing about that column like 6 months later. So I could see it was hurting people, and I needed to correct my mistake. And what's amazing is what came out of that was, I think, obviously more readership, which wasn't the intention, but that is what happened. And what also came out of it is an acknowledgement that we all make mistakes. And then I got better. I think I'm better at writing about racism, Supreme Court justices, passing away and how that affects us. The things that I think most doctors, like you said, wouldn't write about. And I've learned to take the negative feedback with the positive and try to learn from the negative feedback. What's great is I offend Democrats and Republicans. So I'm feeling really good about that. It's not that I just offend one party or the other. I've always been kind of an independent person. So if I'm making all sides of the aisle think, I feel like I'm doing what I want to do in the world.
Well, that certainly is something that I think makes you truly unique. And seriously, I mean, I'm not trying to be obsequious. That's a real point that people should make. I don't think I can name a columnist or a commentator or anybody in TV news, radio news, the blogs or whatever that actually takes that stance. What we see is that people decide they're going to accept a label and they're going to defend that particular point of view regardless of what comes down the pike. It's almost as though they feel an obligation to defend the tribe, if you will. But now comes along a pediatrician who says, this is what I think. Let me know what you think, and maybe I'll change my mind. And you actually did that, didn't you?
Well, I did. I wouldn't say I changed my mind on my thoughts that the justice system needs to have, change. But I certainly changed my thoughts on how I expressed myself when I'm talking about controversial subjects. And I learned a great deal. And what's interesting is even that patient later said she was scared. I'll just say blankless. You can fill in whatever word you want. She was really scared to call her doctor and tell her that she did a terrible job. And I remember talking with her later and saying, I'm so glad you took that chance, though. I'm so glad you did, because I'm better for it and I hope you're better for it. And to me, that's what this is all about. You talk about the tribe. I could never consider a tribe my political party because I feel like all of that is transient. I understand the president's the president, our legislators are our legislators, but none of that is forever. But you know what? My patients are my tribe. My family is my tribe. And those people are more important to me than any right answer politically or wrong answer politically. And that's what's been amazing about doing what I do, is that my tribe are my amazing patients that I've had for now, 30, 40 years. They've been coming to the same practice. Actually, it's going to be 50 years this January. They've been coming to the same practice for 50 years. That's outlasted any politician and any president and any, maybe not the Constitution, let's say. That still beats us. But again, there's these universal truths about human beings, that kindness goes a long way. Empathy is always important. Listening to your patients, valuing who they are, even if you don't always agree with them. I like to say that none of my patients listen to me. They don't give a darn heck what I say. They're going to do what they're going to do anyway. And the thing is, I still love that about them. They will tell me when they come back, like, nah, I didn't fill those antibiotics. I thought you were wrong. I don't think I needed those. And I'll say, okay, well, your kid's better, so I guess you were right. And so it's a willingness to say, hey, I'm human too, and I don't know everything, but I think together we can find the answer.
Well, what a refreshing outlook that is. And I don't even know how to tell you how impressed I am at your approach. And quite frankly, I wish we had more people like you. It's been a lot of fun talking to you, asking you questions, picking your brain. But we're at the point, Niran, where I'm going to turn the program over to you and sit quietly. And if you would be so kind as to give us your personal prescriptions for success.
Okay. Well, basically, you've probably heard some of them already throughout the program, but my personal prescriptions for success are basically be exactly who you are. Don't try to change for other people. Women especially get labeled as aggressive or too bossy or too domineering. And the thing is, some of those traits are required for medicine. So again, be who you are, because when you're being genuine, the right patients will find you. And then you end up being able to help people, I think, to a greater extent, because you're not worrying about what someone thinks or how you sound. You're worrying about saving their life. Probably my second thing would be learning to sift the personal from professional feedback. So again, sometimes someone will give you information that you didn't do well on, whatever it was. We could use the newspaper, my writing for the newspaper as an example. And I try to look at it from the perspective, this isn't about me as a human being. This is about something I've done or something I can do better. So again, sifting through, it isn't that you're a flawed human being who can never fix it. It's something maybe you have to learn, and you can go ahead and make changes and do that. And then finally, simply brutal honesty will be your friend. I always tell people, for good or for bad, exactly what I'm thinking if I'm asked. So I don't sugarcoat things. I don't try to beat around the bush. I simply lead with, this is what I think. This is what I'm seeing. This is why. And, do you have questions? So probably my 3 prescriptions for success really are: be exactly who you are, learn to sift from personal and professional, be brutally honest. And I guess kind of a part of the brutal honesty is be humble and still be bold. But at the bare bones, always just be yourself and be honest, because I think that's the best way to start any relationship. So those are my 3 prescriptions for success, 3.5.
Well, there's a lot of wisdom in there, and we appreciate you sharing that with us. This is Dr. Niran Al-Agba from Silverdale, Washington, who has shared her prescriptions for success. It's been a pleasure being with you today, Niran. And before we go, I want to give you an opportunity to tell people where they can find you, how they can contact you, and where they can see what you write if they'd like to.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me. It's a great opportunity. My personal blog is just my name, niranalagba.com, which is niranalagba.com. I'm at Silverpeds on Twitter. And then I have a couple of Facebook pages. My blog also is posted at Mommy Doc on Facebook. And then I have my business page, which is Silverdale Pediatrics. I write a bi-monthly column for the Kitsap Sun newspaper, which is a subsidiary paper of USA Today. And then I actually have a book coming out soon. It's coming out in November, titled Patients at Risk, The Rise of the Nurse Practitioner and Physician Assistant in Healthcare, that has been co-written with Rebecca Bernard. And so look for that on bookshelves soon.
Well, we will be looking forward to that. I bet it's going to be a great book. So once again, let me say thank you very much, Dr. Niran Al-Agba from Silverdale, California. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
And that brings us to the close of another episode of Prescription for Success. Before we go, I want to encourage everyone to become a subscriber to our podcast. When you do, you can get even more information about our guests by reviewing the show notes on our website at rxforsuccesspodcast.com. And while you're there, please be sure to leave us a comment, and if you feel so inclined, give us a 5-star rating as well. We would really appreciate that. We also hope you'll support the show by becoming a patron. To do that, all you have to do is visit patreon.com/RX for Success podcast. Thank you so very much for listening today, and don't forget to fill your prescription for success with my next episode.